Here. So hello, welcome to our talk with Professor Russell Meeuf and his book, White Terror, the horror film from Obama to Trump. We are just going to give people a few more minutes to arrive and also to log in online. We do have a, this is live streamed as well as being in person. So we're going to go ahead and start, I would say, at about maybe five minutes-ish. Okay, so while we wait, let me just kind of go over a little bit of information about the American Library and about the organizer of this particular event. So my name is Linda Shepard, and I am the library coordinator here at the American Library. The American Library is a memorial to the 2nd Air Division, 8th Air Force, United States Army Air Forces. And we are one of the oldest living memorials dedicated to those who served here in East Anglia during World War II as part of what was known as the Friendly Invasion. The people who served here were part of the 2nd Air Division. They came over en masse to this particular area starting just after we entered the war in 1942 and continued to be here and establish a very close connection with the people of this particular area until basically 45 when we ended up leaving and assisting with the Pacific Theater until the end of World War II. The people following the war, part of the 2nd Air Division, wanted to do something to memorialize not only the 7,000 men who lost their lives while serving here as part of the 2nd Air Division, but also to continue that friendship bridge that was so strongly established during their time here. So they formed very close relations. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to form a memorial, and they wanted to form something that was uniquely American and hence a memorial library. So the funds were beginning to be pulled together as early as 1945 as part of the 2nd Air Division Memorial Trust. And then by 1963, we were able to open our doors here in the old library, which existed in this particular location, however, in a very different building. So if anybody was here in about 1994, what happened in 1994 to change kind of the game, as it were? There was exactly, on the 1st of August, there was a fire in the old library building. It actually started in the American Library reading room. And all of our collections were completely destroyed. Our collections were completely destroyed. So, for example, the signature of Jimmy Stewart when he came as a visitor during the formation of the library in 1963, the accommodation letter was given to us by John F. Kennedy. All of these things were lost. Luckily, some of the more historical artifacts that were housed in the old Norfolk Record Office, which was also here in the old Memorial Library building, were salvaged. And the upshot, kind of a silver lining to that gray cloud, is that we got this wonderful, wonderful space. So we've been here in this particular location since 2001, and when the library opened. And so in addition to having a amazing collection of World War II and 2nd Air Division related information, we also are a living memorial. So we have a lot of information about all different aspects of American culture. We host 2 book groups. We have a record club that meets monthly at the end of the month. And coming up, as many of you saw on your chairs, we have a boisterous bash featuring the wonderful Allie Smith, who is, like me, a fellow New Yorker, who came, and as you can tell probably from my accent, I'm not from Norfolk. I'm originally from New York. And I always kind of joke and say I'm from Suffolk, but you know, I'm actually from New York. And Allie is going to be joining us. She is a punk rocker. She is a photographer. She is a memoirist. And so we're going to have a boisterous bash to welcome her book, Ballad of Speedball Baby, that's going to be happening on the 6th of November. So I hope you all can join us for that. And so we are going to give people just a few more minutes. We're going to wait for Russell to log in, and then we'll go ahead and start the program. So again, thank you everybody for coming and for joining us for this event.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, how are you? Yes.
Doing
Yes.
just fine.
Yes. So we have a kind of a somewhat packed house here. Unfortunately, I am not able to turn my camera to view them, but they're all eager and waiting. So would you like to go ahead? I've already introduced ourselves in the American Library. So Russell, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and a little bit more about the project, White Terror, the horror film from Obama to Trump?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Russell Meeuf, and I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Media here at the University of Idaho in the northwest of the United States. And it's actually a very soggy, rainy day today, so I might turn on my supplemental light here. This is a project that has grown out of a class that I've taught here at the university for a long time that was titled American Nightmares, that explored the history of the US horror film and how that history is tied to different types of historical traumas. As I was teaching that class, we were looking at a lot of kind of the longer scope of US history and horror storytelling. And I kept thinking about like how we would characterize the kind of the horror of the present, right? The kind of the particularly the Obama era horror between 2008 and 2016, and trying to think about what it would mean to try to historicize the types of horror stories that we were telling in that period. So that's how I got started on this project, and I'm excited to talk about it a little bit.
Excellent. So, so tell me a little bit about the sort of, so what characterizes the film, the horror film, let's say, within the Obama era? Like, what would you say would be some of the characteristic examples, and what is some of the ethos behind the horror films of that particular time?
Yeah, and I actually have some slides that I'm
Perfect.
happy to pull up. If you give me one quick second here.
Yeah,
Let my computer try to warm up here.
I know, right? Yeah. Technology is our greatest friend, always.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me remember how to do this so that you can still see everything, but not see my messy desktop. Okay, so let me go to reading view.
Great. Okay, so I'll just let you take it away if that's okay. And then, so I'll let you go ahead and talk a little bit about your project. And then following your discussion, then we'll go ahead and open up to questions, both from myself and from the room, both the room on virtual room and also the room, physical room here at the American Library. Is that okay with you?
That sounds great. And
Okay,
if everybody
perfect.
can give me one moment, I am going to turn on an extra light in here because it is darker
Okay.
than I thought it was going to be in my office this morning. So pardon for one sec.
Yep.
Ah, that's a little bit better. You can see my face now. So, all right. So, yeah, thanks for having me here, and I'm happy to chat about my project. As I said, this is based on my book. So this is the wrong PowerPoint. Sorry. Those were the wrong slides. That was from the one next to it here. Terribly sorry about that. Give me one second. I want these slides. Okay. Darn it. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties moving it from one computer to the other here. Give me one second here. Okay. Let's try this one.
That one looked fascinating too, though. So
That was a good one. That was from a talk I gave a little while back that was mostly focused on haunted houses. This is going to be a little bit more general. Okay, this is the right one. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay.
perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So in this project, part of what was getting me thinking about this project here, and can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Was thinking about the ways that horror storytelling had become infused with politics, particularly definitely in the era of Trump, and then looking back towards the Obama era as well. And so there was a few images that kind of really caught my eye as I was working on this project and thinking about kind of the history of horror and the intersects with politics, that made me really think about kind of presidential politics and the ways in which horror had become so part of the fabric of US horror. So this is an artist's rendering of Trump as one of our alien creatures from Carpenter's They Live. And we started seeing on the internet these kind of very creepy horror-related images of the early Trump years. And so Trump with Steve Bannon embedded into his face, or people mocking Melania Trump's first White House Christmas decor by likening it to The Shining. And so it was really interesting to think about this political moment in the US in which many of the political norms that those of us in the US had kind of grown up with and thought about in terms of how we think about presidential politics were being kind of upended, right? We had a candidate who, and then a president who openly embraced xenophobia in ways that would have been politically toxic just years before, who actively bragged about sexually assaulting women with no repercussions to kind of his political standing, was espousing openly anti-democratic rhetoric. And so the imagery and mood of horror really seemed to lend itself in these kind of early Trump years and thinking about how to characterize this kind of political moment. And horror seemed like the most apt lens to do it. And this really kind of dovetailed with, of course, like the rise of Jordan Peele and kind of the way that he was able to demonstrate both the kind of the critical and commercial success of horror that directly engages with racial politics, with kind of the politics of the Obama era. So we got these kind of critically successful horrors films at this moment in which activists on the left were characterizing kind of the Trumpian moment as horrific and using horror to try to understand that. But that really made me want me to look back, right? Because horror obviously has a long tradition of kind of critical political engagement. And we talked about this a lot in the 70s with horror that is actively engaging with a particular political moment. But when I looked back at the films that led up to this moment and thinking about the horror that was happening between about 2008 and 2016, I saw something kind of different happening, right? A kind of a marked shift in that. And so the book that I wrote, White Terror, is really about looking back to the horror of the Obama era and thinking about the stories that were told in that period, right? So with the election of Obama, despite the kind of like the optimistic calls for we're moving into kind of this post-racial society, we saw white racial resentment on the rise. We saw conservatives fixated on the idea that it wasn't just kind of white homes and haunted houses that were infested by demonic politics, but the White House itself. Conservative movements like the Tea Party would become obsessed with the idea that Obama was some sort of demonic outsider present that was undermining all of what was supposed to be good and pure in US culture and society. So at a moment when we had this highly educated and appealing Black family in the White House, we saw increasing white racial resentment and this kind of idea that white folks were getting pushed to the back of the line in American society, even if it wasn't reflected in the actual statistics that we had about what was happening. So I wanted to look back then and think about the horror that the US kind of deserved in that period, right? Thinking about what types of stories were we telling in the lead up to Trump during this moment of kind of white racial resentment and backlash to Obama? What kinds of fears and anxieties were being portrayed in horror cinema in that period? Right. So I had some kind of key questions, right? So, right. So like, what were the fears that were so dominant, right? So, and one of the things that I saw were these kind of fears of outsiders disrupting the sanctity of the US family, fears of evil forces kind of transforming our loved ones or turning young peoples against older generations, fears about technology moving too fast. And so I wanted to try to capture and characterize the what I saw as the most prominent kind of cycles and anxieties of that period. But I started just by looking at the general kind of whiteness of horror in this period. Now, obviously, Hollywood as an industry has been going through some soul searching over the last decades around issues of representation, and is famously, uh, troubled in terms of how the frequency with which we represent people of color, and also kind of the representations therein. And so I looked specifically at horror between 2008 and 2016 to answer these, to look at this, to think like, to what extent can we think about the horror genre not just as a genre that, because it's in Hollywood, happens to have a lot of white representation, but to what extent can we think about horror as an actually white genre, a genre that's interested and invested in the stories, the fears and anxieties of the white middle classes? So, a quick survey of 147 US horror films released between 2008 and 2016. And if people have questions about how I come to the number of 147, it's kind of, they had a kind of a complex formula I was using to determine what I saw as like mainstream horror in that period. But of those, there was a respectable 61 films, so that's about 41%, that featured people of color in some significant roles. But when you looked at the main characters, right, so people who had an actual protagonist that was a person of color in these horror films, we saw a much smaller 7.4%, 11 of those films. And then actually, when you push on that a little bit further, of those 11 films, only 3 of those were actually parodies of horror filmmaking that featured people of color as protagonists, films like Meet the Blacks from 2016. And then another 3 featured mixed race or Latinx actors who were known for playing kind of white or ambiguously ethnic characters, like Jesse Williams' role in The Cabin of the Woods. So when you actually look at films that have acknowledged people of color in the protagonist role in horror films, that left 5 of the 147, so a kind of measly 3.4%. So I want to kind of course, recognize that there's a long tradition of people of color taking the horror genre and making their own horror films, and certainly a long tradition of kind of fandom and support for amongst people of color for American horror. So this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it would seem clear in this period that when we're talking about the mainstream U.S. horror film in the Obama years, we're talking about white families, white folks, white protagonists, right? That the horror film was a kind of a key place in which the U.S. middle class was talking about its fears and anxieties. So, I then took those 147 films and I tried to categorize them into what I saw as the most kind of predominant cycles of the period. So these are cycles that have longer histories, obviously, but that were particularly predominant between 2008 and 2016, whether we see like an increase in the kind of the rate in which they get produced, or that they kind of like had disappeared in the kind of the Bush and Clinton years, but kind of re-emerge a little bit. And the obvious one is the haunted house. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but the Obama years saw a kind of a huge spike and increase in haunted house films that are usually focused on white families that find that their home is not a safe refuge that they thought it would be. Linked to that, we also saw a much smaller cycle, but an increase of home invasion films, and usually in which wealthy white folks confront kind of the violence simmering beneath the surface of white respectability. We saw a rash of demonic possession films in which typically white patriarchs must kind of reestablish control over the unruly and women and children in their lives. We saw horrific child films. So these are films in which typically white mothers are confronted with the specter of some sort of demonic child in their house that they have to grapple with and contend with. And often that can be maybe not just a child, but a doll or some sort of childlike entity that is kind of punishing them, and they have to kind of reassert their motherhood in their own homes. We also saw, obviously, with the success of the Paranormal Activity films, a wave of kind of horrific technology films, some of which were films in which technology becomes haunted, and others are ones in which people think technology is going to be able to document and save them from their hauntings. So we saw those, a lot of films in which white families think that surveillance technology is going to be the solution to their problems. Famously, a lot of horror remakes in this period. Interestingly, this is coming off of a period in which Hollywood was doing a lot of international horror remakes. In the Obama years, it's much more focused on remakes of kind of classic 70s and 80s horror than it was on international horrors. And a lot of these films, we see the idea promoted, that the idea of that, like, that the present U.S. culture is somehow demonstrably worse, more scary, more grisly than the past that was imagined in some of these classic films. So in the book, what I try to do is take each of these different types of tropes and really explore kind of the cultural histories of each one and think about why in this moment that particular trope might be resurgent, how it connects to politics of that day, how it helps us think about like the white middle classes and the fears and anxieties that the white middle classes are experiencing. And obviously the haunted house film is the easiest one to kind of look at that cultural context, because these are films that are happening in the kind of the wake of in the middle of and in the wake of the Great Recession, in which we had this massive housing crisis, the housing bubble burst, and suddenly, of course, we're telling lots and lots of stories about white families who move into new houses and find that those houses aren't going to make them economically secure, but are actually going to undermine their social standing. Um, so there was a lot of these types of films made between 2008 and 2016. By my count, the U.S. film industry produced 32 somewhat popular haunted films with a haunted house element to it that grossed at least $1 million in that theatrical release, and that was 21% of all of the top grossing horror of the Obama era had some sort of haunted house in it. So this was clearly an anxiety that was on folks' minds. Obviously, there's an industrial component to this. When we see the success of films like The Conjuring, it inspires imitators to also tell those types of stories. But there was clearly something happening in the U.S. That was fixated on the idea of housing and housing and precarity, and the idea of houses as being kind of haunted economically. Now, there's a really a great amount of wonderful research talking about the kind of the linking of these kind of recessionary fears and the horror of the haunted house film. But in my book, I wanted to point out the ways in which that it wasn't just recessionary fears; that these were also racialized anxieties. That the stories we were telling about haunted houses weren't just about fears of, like, your home value coming away, but fundamental fears that the white middle classes were experiencing about economic precarity, especially given that the home ownership has been one of the primary engines for middle class growth in the U.S. and other places. But also one of the primary ways in which kind of racial inequalities have been perpetuated, particularly after World War II, and the support and structures that were given to white homeowners at the expense of people of color. So at this moment in the, around when we get the Great Recession in the mid 2000s, this moment where housing is no longer this mechanism for the growth of the middle class and the growth of the white middle class in particular, we start seeing stories told over and over again about people who get into these houses and find that they're not just that their economic standing is under threat, but in some ways their racial standing is under threat because they're not able to succeed in the ways that they had before. Uh, So, yeah, there's a lot of different narratives across these haunted house films, but they have some core themes, right? Usually about the kind of this declining fortunes of white folks in an era of white guilt and white victimization. Um, so across the Obama era haunted house film, white families are haunted not only by ghosts and demons and aliens, but by the nagging fear that they've lost their privileged social standing in a changing economy. Um, and they kind of ask these series of questions of us around not just economics, but around white identity, right? So, so Yeah, sorry. So what if the system that has propped up white privilege and white economic stability for so long was finally kind of crumbling for the white middle classes? What if white folks would have to face the same kind of economic disadvantages that people of color have faced for so long? Um, so white folks are looking to home ownership for salvation only to find that the house makes them vulnerable. But what they're really finding here is this dread that they might not be as privileged as they imagined, or they might not have the same privileges that they had historically, right? So, and then of course, right, tied to that also, like, should they then feel guilty about the privileges that they have had in the past that they feel are now moving along or kind of being pulled away from them? So we see this across a lot of films in the period. The Poltergeist remake is a kind of a classic example of this, in which the plight of the family gets exacerbated by the Great Recession, and the father has been laid off, and his masculinity is under siege. But it illustrates throughout that the kind of the linking of racial identity and economics in a lot of these films. So if we look, for example, at The Haunting in Connecticut, this is about a family that's drowning in debt due to the high cost of their son's cancer treatments, and they move into a new house so they can be closer to the hospital where he's treated, only to find that there's these paranormal entities haunting them there. In The Conjuring, the family's moving out to the country in the 70s to make a better life for their 5 daughters, but the father, who's a truck driver, is struggling to pay the bills for this new house out there. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, the father's remodeling a 19th century estate and has all his money tied up into it and has to turn it around. In Sinister, a true crime writer whose career is on the rocks is trying to use this new house to write a new book that's going to save his family economically. The US UK co production, The Woman Black, is also about a man whose wife has died and his job is on the line for this new client that he takes on. So there's always this intertwining of racial identity and kind of economic precarity throughout the haunted house narrative. So it becomes a very potent way in which the idea of the white middle classes is interrogated throughout the Obama era. Um, there's also kind of an interesting trend within a lot of the haunted house films that aren't just about economic precarity, but also about the past, right? Haunted house films are about how people engage with the past, living in a home that has a longer past, and how that past can come back to haunt you in a moment. And a lot of these narratives are explicitly about the horrific actions of past white homeowners who've done horrific things to maintain their wealth. And so there's raises these questions about the families who live there and whether or not they should feel guilty about the corruption that came from whiteness in the past. So in The Boy, there's a wealthy couple who fakes the death of their young son after he brutally murdered a playmate, and they lock him into these secret passageways into the house, and trying to like steal away, like kind of secure away the disreputability from his actions. The Woman in Black, the ghost there was another deranged young woman, but who was from a wealthy family who was able to be locked away because wealth was able to protect protect the family. In films like The Haunting in Connecticut and Ouija, they tell very similar stories about precarious supernatural families in the past who used their powers to try to pay their bills, but then left an imprint on the house. So there's all these kind of lingering concerns around what white folks have done in the past that have created the current context of white privilege, and what are the responsibilities of the families in those houses today to grapple with that. So it was really fascinating that in this moment, yeah, in which we had this, a black family in the White House for the first time, that there was so much discourse in U.S. Horror cinema around houses and privilege and whiteness, that kind of wrapped up into the kind of the stories that we were telling about whiteness. Um, yeah, and this extends across the different cycles of horror that I had mentioned at the start. So I identified those 6 horror cycles. And so just for an example, if you look at like a horror film about technology, like Paranormal Activity 2, and thinking about it as part of this larger trend of horrific technology films, in the book, I try to situate that within surveillance culture and thinking about how our ideas about surveillance have changed as we start thinking more about race. So in a moment in which the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of proliferation of technology is increasingly showing us that the kind of the racial inequalities that are existing in our world, that's upending this kind of common white bourgeois idea that surveillance is always neutral and good in the world. And so we start seeing horror films that are about that idea of what can you document, what can you document, what are the ethics of documentation? Will documenting save your family, or will it just document your own demise? So these films are tied up in these ideas around whiteness, white privilege, and precarity. Um, and we also see it in cycles like the possession and exorcism films. So I don't know if anyone has seen the 2012 film The Possession, which is about this divorced white patriarch who's struggling to make ends meet. He's kind of relegated to this semi-abandoned track home neighborhood that has fallen apart in the Great Recession, and finds that one of his daughters becomes possessed by a Dybbuk, a Jewish demon, and he has to reassert his patriarchal authority over the family in order to kind of kind of restore the family and save his daughter. And we see that throughout a lot of these possession and exorcism films. This idea of the white patriarch who's struggling with his masculinity and economically, but has to revert to this kind of very extreme worldview in order to save what's happening in his day-to-day life with his family. And so that's actually a really interesting an interesting political move as well. The possession films I've actually become very, very fascinated by in the ways that they seem to kind of presage and line up pretty neatly with some of the ideological ideas behind the MAGA movement. So when I was writing about the possession and exorcism film, I kept thinking about this kind of ways in which the general worldview of a possession film it becomes very, very tied to and linked with the kind of vision of the world produced by the MAGA movement. In both ideas here, right, there's these sinister outside forces that have infiltrated families and public life, but you know, in the horror film, it's demons and whatnot. But in the MAGA movement, it's critical race theory, it's transgender acceptance, it's social emotional learning, it's immigrants. It's there's always a new boogeyman that is kind of constantly attacking the kind of the worldview of the white middle classes. But in both the possession films, and in the MAGA movement, mainstream systems of knowledge, whether we're talking about journalism, academia, science, medicine, won't take your concerns seriously. In fact, will mock you for questioning their authority. And only these kind of disreputable shaman with these very stark worldviews will be brave enough to speak the truth to you. And just instead of priests and shamans or occult experts in the possession films, we instead get like far right media commentators like just Alex Jones or Tucker Carlson or all these other right wing figures who are convincing people that, oh, there's this secret knowledge that the mainstream doesn't want you to have, but I will show you what that knowledge is. And then in both movements, the only solutions are this kind of constant vigilance against these outside forces. So kind of seeing the world in these stark black and white terms in which any kind of concession is gives away the whole the whole ideological pie. And you have to engage in this constant vigilance, and then usually undertake ritualistic, bizarre acts of violence to purge your family or to purge the government from this threat. When January 6th happened, right, it was, you know, it's probably not a stretch to say that for many of those folks participating, it was a form of exorcism for them, right? It was this ritualistic violence that they saw as necessary to purge entities from the government that was going to restore restore kind of wholesomeness in their view to the U.S. government. So that there's this really interesting kind of overlapping happening between horror and U.S. politics in this moment, right? And it's aligned with, right, a turn in the MAGA movement to become increasingly grisly and apocalyptic, right? That it's that while we saw artists and activists using the horror trope to kind of criticize and critique the Trump movement, the MAGA movement also engages in this kind of deployment of horror as a descriptor for what's happening in U.S. culture and society. And obviously, former President Trump's rhetoric has been increasingly apocalyptic and increasingly horrific. Right, his first speech as president cited, famously cited American carnage as kind of his vision of what he saw happening in American politics. The current discourse around immigrants eating domestic pets is very much a kind of like a horror narrative around outsiders disrupting the sanctity of small town life. Trump's claims that the current state of crime is one of bloodshed, chaos, and violence, which is not supported by statistics, but is certainly part of this like horrific worldview of what's happening on our streets. And recently, even former President Trump echoed the logic of the Purge franchise, in which he called for one real rough, nasty, violent day of retaliation to get crime in check here. So there's a real invocation of the tropes and themes of horror on this amongst right-wing rhetoric right now as well. And so it's a really fascinating political moment that I think we find ourselves in when both the right and the left feel like horror is potentially the key way in which they want to describe what's happening in US politics. And for those on the left, it's this perceived horror of fascism and xenophobia and sexism and amongst the Trump movement. And for those on the right, it's this idea that neoliberal Democrats are enmeshed in these vast, horrific conspiracies to undermine what's happening in our world. So obviously, this is indicative of the high levels of polarization in American politics, but it's just fascinating that we're living in this kind of Manichean world in which there's demons and conspiracies lurking behind the facade of everyday politics to a kind of an unprecedented scale, at least in my lifetime. So not surprisingly then, when we look at the horror post 2016, right, of the Trump and Biden years, we've seen a much more even divide, I think, in some of the storytelling than we did in the Obama era. If the Obama era was really dominated by stories about the white middle classes and kind of more kind of classic stories about like haunted houses, home invasions, possessions, and whatnot, we do see more variety and diversity in contemporary horror storytelling of the past 8 years. One, there's absolutely more people of color in contemporary US horror storytelling. I didn't bring the statistics with me, but you do see a marked increase. And part of that, again, is the success of Jordan Peele. He was able to demonstrate that there's a marketability for horror films that engage with racial politics. And so we've seen many more kind of imitators and other folks who are trying to bring that to horror storytelling, but also indicated that there's an appetite in US culture for horror that is engaging with politics, the politics of race, the politics of class. And so we're seeing a variety of shows leaning into that. The TV shows in particular have kind of taken up the mantle of this in this period. So we see shows like Lovecraft Country and Them, which are both explicitly and overtly about the histories of race in the US and kind of using horror as a lens to describe those histories, or contemporary horror films like Barbarian, which are interrogating kind of the historical roots of horror, using Detroit again as a setting in which we can explore kind of the degradation of the white middle classes in the period, or even shows like Midnight Mass, Flanagan's Midnight Mass, which is very much about what happens when ideologues use their religious worldview to try to describe something that's clearly horrific, right? And they lose track of the horrors that they're unleashing on the world because they can justify it through kind of these different religious claims. So we do see more of that type of storytelling. At the same time, we still see a continuation of some of the many trends focused on whiteness, the white middle classes, economic precarity in this period. So it's much more evenly divided. We still see a continuation of exorcism films have been particularly popular and doing well in this period, but also the trope of the besieged white mother has absolutely still continued on with films like Evil Dead Rise, Megan, and if anybody saw the Rebecca Hall's thriller Resurrection, um, uh, there's still a very consistent exploration of whiteness and the white middle classes and white motherhood as well. So it's a very divided era in U.S. politics, obviously, and in U.S. horror storytelling in the last 8 years, as it kind of as horror is grappling with the kind of the polarization of the country that emerged, particularly in the Obama period. So, um, so I feel like I've talked enough about my book, and I'd love to hear what your questions are. So I would love to hear what you all have to say.
Excellent. So thank you so much. Let's give a big hand to this. Okay, so does anyone have any questions from the audience? Yes, Ben.
Hi, thank you so much for an amazing talk. I might be stepping on Linda's toes a little bit asking this question, but I wondered if you could expand on this, obviously outsider's perspective. I'm from the UK. There seems to be, when we sort of talk about right, we talk about sort of the evangelical right, that's sort of Christian right, but then you sort of, a big image specifically from that sort of conspiratorial right is the QAnon shaman. So I wondered, and there seems to be that sort of clash between Christian religiosity and then maybe sort of more esoteric and sort of ritualistic, sort of magic almost. And I wondered if that sort of appears, that sort of conflict within those discussions on spiritualism and conspiracy and cult isms, I suppose, whether that appears within that those horror films that you've sort of examined, specifically around sort of the Trump era.
Did you hear that question, Russell?
Yeah, I think I'd hear that. That's a really fascinating question, and I think that that's like really super fascinating for American politics, yeah, because we're absolutely in this moment right now with that, you say politics makes for strange bedfellows, but in which you have like evangelical Christian right folks who are aligning themselves politically with like very secular but conspiracy-minded QAnon followers who see conspiracies behind everything, and there's a lot of like divisions within that, but that they are still unified. I mean, I think that's kind of the political power of Trump, is to unify a pretty big umbrella of folks who want to challenge orthodoxies in different ways. That's a great question about whether we see it reflected in the horror. Mostly when you ask the question, I see it reflected in my everyday life, and that like I live in a small town with a state college, but that we have a very far right hyper Christian church in town that wants to be very politically active, and they have this kind of like semi-famous hard right evangelical pastor, but who also like is supported by other elements in our community who are just maybe more conspiracy minded, even if they don't identify with the kind of the Christian nationalism that he espouses. Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, part of this is, looking at mainstream US horror films, like they don't get into the weeds a lot on sometimes of those divisions. And I think particularly the Obama era, like demonic possession films are very kind of general in scope about this kind of worldview that I think applies to a lot of different contexts of, okay, the world is black and white, whether you see that as Christian or not Christian, right? Or just good and evil, secularly good and evil, but like the world is black and white. There's vast conspiracies in place to make sure that you don't see the truth that's out there, whatever that truth might be. And while those films do tend to be religious in nature, right, they're obviously focused on this idea of like, okay, this is about God and spirituality, and whether people who maybe don't see themselves as spiritual are willing to like see God and evil in their day-to-day lives. The worldview is very much just conspiratorial. And I think a good example of that is there's a really bad but fascinating haunted house film called Dark Skies, which is actually an alien invasion haunted house film about this family that gets targeted by aliens. And it takes on the structure of a possession exorcism film, because they have to then engage in their research and go out and find an occult expert, but they're essentially like going on the web and finding, you know, an expert played by J.K. Simmons who could easily just be a QAnon supporter, who's like, yeah, if you know where to look on the internet, I can tell you exactly what's happening to you. And so it's very secular in nature, but it's that same kind of tendency to like create an umbrella for all sorts of unorthodox opinions about the world, right? They're like, okay, science can't help you, academics are corrupt, you know, your doctor's not going to help you. Just a questioning institutions in general. But I don't know that I've seen something that really gets into the weeds of those divisions within that movement. And that's really fascinating. I'm going to make a note because I'm going to start looking for that now.
Excellent. Good. Any other questions? Yes.
I have, Russell, it takes so long to get a movie made that were you able to see in your research, so Obama got elected November 08, took office January 09. Were you able to see a real shift in how quickly that movies would come out with like house, what do you call it? Haunted houses or whatever. I mean, it's been my entire life, obviously, a haunted house, but I'm just trying to picture if you could really show through research that election actually did cause more, or was there just some successful haunted house movies that happened about the same time, and then all of a sudden they went out and bought all these existing scripts? I mean, you know, it takes a long time to make a movie, so.
Yeah, and I think it's both, right? Like, so like, it absolutely is kind of industrial in terms of, yeah, that question of, okay, like the Conjuring comes out, makes a lot of money, and suddenly everyone's like, hey, find me a script like The Conjuring, and they rush those into production. But part of that is also cultural in that The Conjuring resonates because of what's happening in a particular moment. It's not just a well-made film, but it's a well-timed film in terms of tapping into anxieties that we're feeling. And so I think there's kind of, I'd say the answer is certainly both of those things. And you can see, in fact, that houses are clearly kind of in the zeitgeist, and that there are some really interesting, prominent haunted house films that are coming out in like 05, 06. There's a little kind of a little blip, like a little cycle in there in which we're seeing more haunted house films, which I think is really fascinating, and thinking about the idea of like, as the bubble is getting really big in the US, people are starting to feel maybe a little bit anxious about that. But when you do look at the numbers, you don't see like Obama gets elected and the next year there's a haunted house, or like there's a Great Recession and the next year there's a haunted house film. Most of that happens like in like 2010, 2012, 2013. So I do think that there's like a catching up period for sure, when like houses are on people's minds. People are like, hey, we need to, you know, we get successful films that are tapping into something in the zeitgeist, and so they're rushing into production more. Blumhouse, the rise of Blumhouse as a successful horror firm is certainly like built into that, right? That they saw that appetite for it and were willing to like put money towards it. So I think it's a complicated question. I certainly don't think it's like a 1-to-1 ratio, right? Like Obama gets elected and suddenly like the studio executives are like, great, haunted house films. I do think you see a kind of like a building up towards both the kind of the commercial viability and the kind of the cultural resonance of those stories happening at that same time.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Great. Yes.
Thanks very much. Just want to check you can hear me.
Can you hear? Because I can always relay. Okay.
I can hear, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. I suppose I'm a historian, so British historian, admittedly, but interested in the extent to which we can actually sort of look a bit further back with some of this, back to, you know, I grew up in the 90s with the X-Files and that kind of sense of the questioning of rationality, in a sense, in favour of sort of Gothic tropes and representations of authority and the threat as well. And I wonder to what extent you see there are longer term trends here, going back to the 70s, the Manchurian Candidate, the 90s, and then one could even go further back, no doubt, if you wanted to. But what extent that there is this an acceleration of trends that have been going on for the last 50 years? And I suppose the linked question is, what are the ways, are you seeing any signs of alternative genres that are looking at maybe counteracting this, looking at ways to bring people together, to map out common territory?
Yeah. All right. So there's a couple of great questions in there. I think in terms of the longer historical trajectories, yeah, absolutely. I think the challenge of writing this book was to like make it very present, and I wanted to be talking about this one historical moment, but also recognizing that this is like a much longer historical conversation that goes back and forth. And I feel like a lot of what I was writing about was actually really resonant with some of the things that was happening with horror in the 1970s, right, in which we saw very similar types of kind of political unrest and political context in the US, and the ways in which horror was kind of on the cutting edge of talking about some of those things in moments in which not a lot of mainstream US film was engaging with some of these questions, right? So like when I talk about home invasion films, it's in many ways, this is The Last House on the Left, and the same concerns that we were exploring in 1973 with Last House on the Left, maybe like kind of went underground for a little while, but then have kind of resurfaced. And I think horror is kind of always doing that a little bit, right? And part of this book is engaging in kind of a longer conversation, in that, a lot of scholars in the 70s were really fascinated by horror's ability to act as a kind of a critical genre, a genre that can call out the excesses of mainstream culture, that can engage with like taboo, abject topics that we don't want to talk about. So like that Robin Wood style of scholarship that's really interested in horror as like a fundamentally critical genre, kind of an anti-bourgeois genre. Then of course we see also these like waves of horror in the post 9/11 horror, which is very much engaged with the righteousness of the U.S. Subjected to violence overseas. We see lots of waves of horror that are not exactly anti-bourgeois, that are not really engaged with these same types of questions. So part of this is this book thinking about that longer question of how and why horror gets used over these longer trajectories. So I think there's definitely longer stories for most of these genres. Particularly, haunted houses are not new in any way, shape, or form, right? The question here is like, why does this very old Gothic storytelling tradition that dates back to like the Castle of Otranto, right? Like, why in this moment in the U.S. did we become fixated by a particular variant of that? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like a really interesting way of thinking about the kind of the longer histories happening here. And I didn't talk about it here, but for trying to determine which of the cycles I wanted to focus on for the book, I did kind of do like a long study going back to 1980, which is the longest I could do because it was a lot of data to parse through, looking at all of the top Hollywood horror films and trying to like actually do little through lines on which ones had kind of like disappeared in the 80s and 90s, and which ones popped up again in the teens, and which ones kind of trying to like parse that out. So I am interested in that longer sense of time here historically, and the book tries to engage with that as it can. As to the second question, that's a really great question around like genres or stories that are trying to do something different, right? They're trying to bring people together. That is fascinating because obviously that's not like, horror is doing the work of a lot of horror Hollywood storytelling, which is to be melodramatic and right to like get in the middle of anxieties and tensions that we're experiencing right now, and whether is it capable of providing alternatives in the mainstream level, I don't know if it's capable of doing that. I think there's a lot of horror films, and again, I don't want to be like I love horror, and I think there's a lot of films even in this period that are actively asking us to ask to explore hard questions around politics and identity. And so I think there's I think that's a useful a bit of a useful storytelling strategy in terms of like bringing us together and thinking about those. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm very cynical about U.S. pop culture at the moment, living, in the run up to the election. So I don't know that I have a good answer for something that I feel like is doing that, other than maybe like, Ted Lasso, getting everybody just to want to be kind to one another. That's always fun.
No, not too close to the slides. So
Oh, would you mind closing your slides for us?
Yeah, you bet.
Excellent, great, thank you, excellent.
That
Great.
easy for
Although the
everybody?
image was great, so yeah,
Yeah.
but yes.
Russell, you said about remakes. You seem to come to the conclusion that they reflected that the time in which they were made was the worst time than the original film was made. Off the top of my head, I don't believe that was consistently my reading of them as I went through it. And very often I read them as being about the problems of the time of the original film coming back, or being something that they're trying to remind us of those anxieties, or have us experience them. Can you talk a little bit more about how you came to that conclusion, and give us some examples?
Yeah, so for the remakes, I was really interested. I mean, part of this is just also the tone of contemporary Hollywood horror storytelling in that period, and that I felt like that a lot of the remakes that were made, they're taking films often from the '80s that were in their day, you know, serious, interesting explorations, but kind of campy, sometimes silly, sometimes comedic, and then translating them into a moment today where horror was supposed to be very dark, grisly. Like if you look at the you know, Nightmare on Elm Street from '84 versus the 2009 2010 remake that they made with Rooney Mara in it, right? That those are tonally very, very different films. And while they're both engaged in very similar and interesting questions around, you know, satanic abuse and child abuse, and you know, the kind of like how teenagers are grappling with the world of the parents and the consequences of the parents' actions. The 1984 film is still kind of campy. It's like it feels like an '80s slasher film, because it is. Whereas the 2009 one is so serious. It takes all of the subtext that is kind of implicit in the first one and makes it explicit. And the teenagers there are just so depressed and so worn down and so traumatized by everything in the world, right? There's this sense that like this is really horrific. Or if we think about the '78 Halloween versus the Rob Zombie Halloween, which again is very much about like Rob Zombie's vision of the world there is that like, okay, US culture here is overtly, for lack of a better word, trashier, right? Like less classy, more degraded, more just kind of filled with corruption than the world of the 1978 Halloween, which is about like the horror of the '78 one is that like the suburbs are supposed to be innocent and pure, and this outside influence comes into it. By focusing so much on the backstory of Michael Myers, the Rob Zombie one is more about how fundamentally corrupt US culture is to begin with, and how Michael Myers is just a product of that horrific corruption that we're experiencing now. And I don't think that's necessarily uniformly true across all of the remakes, but I do think there's a tendency to see that as they're exploring the idea of the past, there's a tendency to that the characters, if in the original they were solidly middle class, in the remakes they're either wealthier and far more corrupt, or much more precarious than they are in the original as well. So those are some of the examples that come to the top of mind. But I'd love to hear some of your examples of films that you think challenge that, because I think that's fascinating too.
I can only think of films that, reiterate that. Like obviously Evil Dead is another example of something that was hugely campy and all of a sudden is a little bit more serious with the remake as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Last House on the Left was one that came to mind in that what happens is effectively tropes from the original film come into the present day. The way that the quote gang are portrayed in that film seems tied to the '70s. They don't seem like a real modern. Do you know what I mean? They're movie trope characters. And though it hasn't got the ridiculous slapstick music and Here Come the Silly Cops sort of stuff that really sort of undermines the film's sort of mood in places, it sort of seems to have a more hopeful and optimistic vibe a lot of the time, apart from the sort of the very end, which seems like a sort of a coda really in some ways. But a lot of it seems to be like you can win in the world of the remake of Last House on the Left. Which, if you look at the original, or indeed the original, if you go back to Bergman, that's not there at all.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, Bergman was never particularly chirpy in the way.
Yeah, and I think with that one, it really just depends on how you take the final scene in that Like, and whether that you see that as like a revert, like whether that undermines that kind of like semi hopefulness that it provides there, or not, right? And that like, yeah, the original one and both I think are about the fundamentally the same thing, right? This idea of these respectable bourgeois families that when push comes to shove, they might seem respectable and bourgeois, but they are capable of horrific violence if subjected to it to themselves, right? And that's like for Last House, that's like fundamentally like that Vietnam War era. We're sending our sons off to do, unspeakable violence in other places. And like, are we actually, is there such a thing as bourgeois respectability? I think both are engaging with that in kind of same or similar ways. I do think, yeah, the recent remake does have like a little bit of, it tracks a little bit more like people can change and you can overcome it until you get to that last scene, and then it's like, actually, no, people are monsters too. So,
Interesting. Yes.
Okay, so I'm doing my PhD on Edgar Allan Poe and adaptation of his work to television, and I still work more with film. But you mentioned some of television. You mentioned Them, Midnight Mass, and briefly show the picture of American Horror Story, not the show, but the show. And then on American Horror Story, we have all of the seasons, if I'm not mistaken, all of them have supernatural elements, except for I think season 7, which is the one that takes place right after the Trump election when he was elected, and maybe that's one of the most disturbing, even though it doesn't have any supernatural elements. But that's one of the shows that is very unlike the films that you mentioned. That okay, maybe through the idea of ghosts, that it represents the fear that people have towards illegal immigrants or some other type of fear, or threat, or social problem. These, at least this season, is very blunt. It's not subtle at all, or so maybe like the fear that left has concerning the extreme right. But I think that's like one of the few examples that I can think of that is very, that says, oh, we are talking about this political scenario. Have you found other situations where, other films, TV shows, where it's like that, where they say, okay, we're talking about this problem specifically, and we are not, so there's not a metaphor, it's this is the exact problem.
that's a great question. I'm glad you brought up TV too, because as I, during the period in which I'm writing about, we start seeing TV horror kind of take off as like a kind of like a really leading, cutting edge of horror storytelling, which complicates the methodology I'm using because I'm only talking about movies here. But yeah, thanks for bringing up TV. That is a great question, right? So you're looking for other examples of horror that's like non-supernatural necessarily, and is like actually focused on like the politics, the horrific politics of a particular issue in a particular time, and kind of what the fallout from that. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like the first thing that came to mind is probably fairly obvious, which is like the Purge franchise, which is not supernatural and very much as a really fascinating franchise in that like it gets like more radical as it goes along, right? The first one is focused on this kind of it's like, oh, it's this middle class family and they're under threat from outsiders. But then when you get to like Purge 2 and Purge 3, it's like, oh, this is a critique of fascism. So and very much focused on like crime, immigration, like poverty, that kind of stuff. But let me think here. That's a great question. So trying to think of things that I have seen that are not supernatural.
Not necessarily that they are supernatural, but that they are not metaphors that they tell you right away. Okay, so this we're talking about this social problem of these people, this group, and we don't like them or we are afraid of them.
Okay.
They do in the scene of I think season 7 of American Horror Story.
Yeah, so yeah, because a lot of horror is like an act of Freudian displacement, right? Like it's like, okay, we're not going to talk about the thing itself. We're going to create these monsters as a way of like processing kind of the cultural baggage around those. But you're interested in ones that there's no sensitive place. It's actually what it is. I mean, another one that comes to mind for me is Blood Quantum, the Canadian Indigenous zombie horror film that's about reservations, right? It's like a zombie film, but like the zombies aren't really a metaphor for anything other than just like it's about reservations and borders and blood purity, and there's not a lot of metaphors there. That's a pretty overt film in that sense. Hmm.
I can think of a couple of good examples, but it's huge spoilers to say what they are.
Go for it. It's fine.
right.
Yeah.
The two films that come to mind, one of them, some people may have I believe, misread the film, but the first one's quite easy to grasp, is Martyrs, which I think is about a kind of religious right-wing movement. When you get to the end, you understand what's happening. Nothing supernatural happens in that film, though it tries to make you think it does for about 90 minutes. At the end, you understand that what you're watching the film is a film about a particular kind of right-wing Christian torture. And a film called The Last Exorcism, which again pretends to be a film about the supernatural, but is actually a fake bit of Christian right-wing propaganda. And it's therefore incredibly subversive. And it's only when you get to the end of the film, you know that you've been watching a pro-Christian propaganda film. And the film itself is intended to be understood as that, not appreciated as that. Therefore, sort of like disliked for being that.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, The Last Exorcism is a good example, of that. Like, short of that the final sequence in that film, right? It's just about like.
But that final sequence confirms that what you're watching is an artificial film made by Cotton and his team as a piece of Christian propaganda. Now, some people say, it shows you a demonic thing. Well, no, it doesn't. It shows you special effects in a fake film that you've been watching. And I don't think a lot of people understand that they've been watching a film in which the special effects aren't actually something that's there, but was something that was put there in the fake post-production of the film by the fake filmmakers we've been watching. So it's a very, very subversive ending, but very, very, very opposed to a lot of the films we're talking about here. A lot of, well, anyway, it seems to be the perfect example.
Yeah, no, I love that film, and I think it's a really interesting example of a lot of these tropes, right? And thinking about, the kind of the meta commentary it makes around like, okay, we're undermining the idea of the exorcism film, but are we actually undermining it? And like, what happens when that unfolds? And just like the condescension that Cotton and his team show to the peoples that he is kind of like has been exploiting monetarily for years, and then actually has to like come face to face with the fact that like they might be right about the world and he's not. So,
Interesting.
At least in the film's perspective. Okay.
So I have a question, actually, if that's okay. So I would like to kind of move it forward a little bit and talk about some of the legacies of Trump and talk a little bit about the post-Roe environment within the United States presently. And what you see as the legacy of this, or what is the kind of the movement that's happening within horror films? Because obviously in the 1970s, we had a bout of those, and you kind of mentioned it in your discussion earlier, these kind of evil children films that trade upon this idea about women's fears, about being kind of roped into motherhood and not being allowed to sort of experience the freedoms that have been promised to them, in the that have kind of been granted to 1970s, like this idea that we should be, shuck like a motherhood and just become these free to be you and me kind of people. And then the child is being something that is evil, that is kind of drawing us back into these sort of tropes of traditional motherhood. And then you have films like I just watched the other night Apartment 7A, and about how I think that speaks very much to this idea where the stakes have changed, and now so she goes to this, she decides that, and again, spoiler, but I don't think it's a spoiler, right? That she's, I'm pregnant with Satan's baby, so I think I should probably have an abortion. And so, but she has to go to this like backstreet abortion clinic where, it's really, that's terrifying in and of itself. And she actually pushes away the woman who's, and this kind of horrific idea of backstreet abortion clinics that might be a reality nowadays in some parts of America. So so what do you see as being kind of the horror film now that do you see any horror films that deal with this particular sort of post-Roe legacy?
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's a great question. I think it actually also speaks to that idea of like the historicity too, because
Mhm.
in many ways, the kind of the horrific child films that I was talking about in the 2008 to 2016 period, I think are very, in many ways, very prescient of and commenting upon the kind of the movement to overturn Roe versus Wade in that period, even if it hadn't yet been overturned, right? That there's all these anxieties around motherhood, and particularly whiteness and white motherhood, and the idea that like, oh, we've created this system in which, there's a lot of like replacement theory nonsense around like the idea that white women, because they've been given these freedoms, aren't having enough babies, and so we're losing the whiteness of the country and that kind of stuff. And so I think actually we've seen just kind of an extension of those same logics into the post-Roe period, because they were already invested in that kind of some of those ideological questions and anxieties around race and whiteness. So, when that Megan movie came out with the robotic kid, which I count as a kind of like a horrific horrific child film, it was abundantly clear, right, that was just going to be a very clear extension. Like I was, my 13-year-old was like, "Oh, should we go watch this?" And I was like, "Well, I'll tell you exactly what's going to happen based on the trailer, because like it's just going to be a continuation of these things where they're going to take a white woman who has chosen not to have kids or and kind of enjoy those freedoms, but through some strange circumstances going to be put in a caretaking motherly position to some sort of child or creature who is going to then like drive her crazy, but in defeating that is going to then reassert and relearn that she needs to like embrace motherhood and real caretaking in the world as a kind of a punishment for that." And so I think we've seen a number of trends towards that, a kind of a continuation of that trend. I pulled out some notes here because I'm actually working on something that like tries to take that chapter and bring it up to the period here, and thinking about the films that have come out post Roe that are both an extension of that logic, but also like maybe adding like a little bit more edge to it, or adding it, kind of taking it from a different perspective. Like for example, the orphan first kill. I don't know if anyone saw that. His main claim to fame was that they took the actor, and even though she's now much taller and not a child, and still made her play the role of Esther in that film. But that's a really interesting example in that the original film was very much of that same, like it's a mother who had fallen on hard times. She was an alcoholic. She almost lost her kids, and so she gets punished for it and has to reassert her motherhood. But in the new version of it, Esther's like the hero against an even more sociopathic mother who does horrific things to her own children. If people haven't seen the Rebecca Hall thriller Resurrection, you should see that. It engages with these issues, but I'm really hesitant to say it because it's engages with these issues through a major plot twist that I don't want to spoil for people, because it's amazing. But like also thinking about the idea of like parenthood and reproductive rights, and who controls whose body, and those types of issues. So I think there's more room for that, but I do think that there's also, I still think we're seeing a lot of the same stuff pre-Roe that we're seeing, or post-Roe that we were seeing pre-Roe, because it's still continuing that same logic, and I think it's still taking Hollywood a little bit of time to kind of
Catch up.
regroup and think about what those dynamics are, right? And that like these films that are about reproductive rights and mothering are still the kind of like monstrous mother who needs to reform kind of narratives, I think.
Interesting. But
Sorry, I wanted to ask, you mentioned in sort of answering a few questions, things about Blumhouse, Mike Flanagan, Jordan Peele, and I wondered if in your methodologies of examining these horror films around that period, you found it a boon or a detriment when these sort of big, like either studios or directors kind of blew up within that period of time, whether that sort of speaks to the things that you're talking about in the book, or whether you sort of have to put those to the side in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think practically as an author, sometimes you just have to get put to the side. It's like the challenge of historical work in general, right? Is like you have you have to have put parameters on things, and like bracketing out TV in general for this book was hard for me, but also necessary in order to like actually have like a product to write about. And so yeah, absolutely. As I was writing and finishing, or like just when it comes out, you're just like, oh, this is an amazing thing that would have been great to be in there, but now it's too late. Oh, so you know, you just keep writing, right? I think Flanagan's a great example of that too, and that I think Flanagan's work is both highly indicative and like reaffirms much of what I'm writing about in White Terror, but sometimes is also like gives us a little bit of interesting critical. I have a love-hate relationship with Flanagan, and that some of it's kind of like, oh, this is interesting, and some of it is just like very much that kind of like really hyper investment in the white middle classes and the white middle class family as a unit that's under siege, and like he reproduces a ton of these types of anxieties. Midnight Mass is probably my favorite of his, because he's actually interested in something larger than that, right? There's kind of larger stakes in that product. But yeah, same thing with like Peel. I was able to squeeze Us into the book. I was like almost completely done writing it when Us came out, and I like literally came home from the theater and was like frantically trying to like, okay, I need to insert this here in this place here. It's only a few paragraphs on it, but so yeah, I think there's absolutely, it's always a challenge, and it's nice to like have stuff come out that reaffirms what you're doing, but it's all, yeah, it is frustrating as an author to like, you have to put those parameters on things.
So speaking of that, what's next for Professor Russell Meeuf? What are you, what's
Well,
next on your?
So I've got, you know, like many people, I've got lots of different things floating that I'm trying to do. The most immediate thing is actually a couple of colleagues and I are actually working on an edited collection just on Jordan Peele's Nope. So it is a whole book of essays just on Nope and Jordan Peele and genre play and cultural illusions and spectacle and race and that kind of stuff. So some really fabulous essays in there that we've been curating and are really happy to get out into the world. As you're asking about Roe, I was pulling up some of the notes that I've been working on a new essay on trying to like take the monstrous children work and kind of do like a post Roe thing. So I'm just in the position of trying to watch movies and trying to pull that together into that. I'm also, you know, much of my research prior to this was on celebrity studies. So like I wrote a book about John Wayne, and I wrote a book about contemporary Hollywood stars and kind of body politics of stars. And I'm actually kind of interested in the fusion of those two, my work in horror and my work on celebrity studies, and thinking about contemporary right-wing media celebrities and how they deploy melodrama and genre in terms of telling particular stories about identity and race in U.S. politics. I gave a presentation at a conference last year about Eamon Bundy, who you might not be familiar with over in the UK. He's an Idaho politician who he was the guy several years ago that took over the federal wildlife refuge with him and his buddies with machine guns, and held the forces, the federal law enforcement